Hello everyone, my name is Gabriel, and today I'm excited to present our work titled Who Should Pay When Machines Cause Harm? Laypeople's Expectations of Legal Damages for Machine-Caused Harm. Our research starts with the question of who is responsible when algorithms cause harm to individuals. Let's think about the case of the prototypical example of bias bail decision making. Who is responsible for these discriminatory outcomes? Is it the judges that work alongside these algorithms? Is it the developers that train the system? Is it the local government that decided to deploy the system in such a high-risk scenario? Or maybe is it the algorithm itself? The issue here is that no entity has total control over the algorithm or understand how it works completely, creating a responsibility gap, which makes it hard to determine who is responsible when things go wrong. This responsibility gap also applies to questions of legal responsibility, since it challenges control and foreseeability, which are important components of legal decisions. Many scholars have proposed ways to bridge this liability gap. Some argue that we must use a strict liability framework, which would hold actors responsible even in the absence of intentionality or fault. Others try to ground the responsibility of developers and users based on vicarious liability, which would view developers and users as the superiors or supervisors of machines. Another approach could be revising product liability law, which would shift responsibility to developers for developing safe products. In this paper, we investigate lay people's perceptions of legal responsibility when machines cause harm. Past work has mostly focused on moral notions of responsibility. Instead of asking who is legally responsible, this past research has largely framed their questions with blame and other notions of moral responsibility in mind. Questionnaires often use ordinal scales, which cannot be easily translated to monetary judgments, which are often how legal judgments are made in the real world. Here, we focus on lay perceptions of legal responsibility by asking how much people expect to be paid as damages when machines cause harm. We ask participants to indicate monetarily how much should be paid in these situations and explore not only how much people expect to be paid, but also by whom. Machines can cause harm in so many different ways. Think about the case of manufacturing robots killing workers, accidents with driverless vehicles, or algorithmic discrimination against particular social groups. In this work, we adopt 37 scenarios proposed by prior work, which covers a wide range of circumstances, from autonomous vehicles crashing to improper advertising. In our study, participants read 8 vignettes out of the 37, such as the one in this slide here, and answered several questions. Participants indicated how much they expected the user and the company that developed the machine to pay as damages for the machine caused harm. Here, we call the company that developed the machine as developers. Participants also indicated the perceived moral wrongness of the scenario using a 7-point scale and whether they identified any victim in the vignette. When looking at how much people expected to be paid as damages, we found significant variation across scenarios. In some, people expected no damages to be paid, while in others, people called for a large amount. We thus analyzed our responses using hurdle models, which is a two-step framework modeling separately the likelihood of obtaining zero values and distribution of non-zero values. Which means that we first analyze whether people called for damages, in other words, whether people expected users and developers to pay for the harm, and then we analyze what is actually associated with expected damages, how much people actually expected to be paid. Scenarios where participants identified victims were 10 times more likely to lead to legal damages. When damages were awarded, victims led to an increase in 262% in how much people expected to be paid. When looking at perceived wrongness, scenarios perceived as more morally wrong were both more likely to lead to legal damages, but were also associated with a larger amount in situations where damages were awarded. When looking at differences between users and developers, we found that users were twice more likely to be exempted from paying damages. In other words, people were more likely to turn to developers when identifying who is liable for damages. However, as I will discuss a little bit later in the presentation, some scenarios show the opposite trend. When we look at the scenarios where participants called for damages, we found that developers were expected to pay 61% more than users. We did not find significant differences between scenarios, which indicates that although the decision of who is held liable may change depending on the scenario, developers are on average expected to pay a larger amount when damages are awarded. So given these our results, let me move to the implications of our findings. First, we found that scenarios with victims and scenarios perceived as more morally wrong called for a larger amount of legal damages. This is consistent with the possibility of stipulating both compensatory and punitive damages. Compensatory damages are those stipulated to compensate those that were harmed, in other words, victims. Punitive damages, on the other hand, are awarded for particularly egregious violations, which we operationalize here as moral wrongness, having the objective of punishing wrongdoers instead of compensating victims. Although these two factors are not exhaustive, right, it doesn't really explain everything that people take into consideration, our work exemplifies how several factors come together to determine how much people expect to be paid as legal damages. Our findings also indicate that people are more likely to turn to developers when identifying who is liable for damages. When damages were awarded, people also expected developers to pay a larger amount. Our work seems at first in contradiction to prior research investigating perceptions of moral responsibility. This past research suggests that developers and users are blamed similarly when things go wrong. However, in this study, we focus on legal notions of responsibility and ask participants to indicate responsibility using monetary awards. What our results indicate is that even though developers may not be the most blameworthy agent, people expect them to be held liable to a higher extent, potentially because they may be in the best position to compensate those harmed, basically in the best position to pay damages. That is not to say that users are exempt from liability. In some circumstances, people first turn to users when identifying who is responsible. One scenario where that happened depicted a town's government using an algorithm to decide what to do during a tsunami. The government's decision to use an algorithm could have been perceived as a breach of the standard of care, since using an algorithm for such a high-stakes scenario is not the standard course of action, which could have shifted liability to the user. Our results have several implications to the regulation of machines. People's tendency to turn to developers when identifying who should pay damages could be considered when designing policies aiming to deal with questions of liability for machine-caused harm. For instance, policymakers could focus on reforming product liability laws in order to focus liability on developers, which is actually something that the European Union has recently proposed. Another factor that could be taken into consideration is the fact that people hold both users and developers liable, suggesting that joint liability frameworks, which would hold multiple actors jointly responsible, could be aligned with lay people's expectations. Nonetheless, our research shows that people have varying expectations about how much should be paid when machines cause harm, and importantly, by whom, raising the question of how to adapt existing liability frameworks to account for this large variance in people's expectations. People may not agree with applying the same framework to a wide range of machine-caused harms. Thank you very much for listening. I'm looking forward to any questions that you may have on the online platform, and thank you.